The gunshot cracked through the quiet of the diner parking lot, just as the neon open 24 hours sign flickered and died, and for a moment nobody inside understood what they had heard, until a chair scraped violently across the tile floor, and someone shouted, "Jesus, someone's been shot out there." Sheriff Daniel Mercer froze halfway through, lifting his coffee mug, his hand trembling just enough to ripple the black surface of the drink as every instinct in his body snapped awake at once. And across the booth, his younger sister Claire stared at him with wide eyes, whispering, "Danny, did you hear that?" Even though everyone had heard it, every trucker, waitress, and tired late-night traveler turning toward the windows where a dark shape had collapsed beside a pickup truck under the buzzing yellow streetlight, and the room erupted into frantic movement as people pushed toward the door while Daniel was already on his feet, his badge catching the diner's fluorescent lights as he ran outside into the cold Wyoming night, where the smell of gunpowder hung faintly in the wind. And when he reached the body, he felt the ground tilt beneath him, because the man bleeding on the asphalt wasn't a stranger. It was Deputy Mark Ellison, his closest friend since the academy, lying on his back with blood spreading across his uniform, while his eyes struggled to stay open. And Daniel dropped to his knees beside him, shouting, "Mark, stay with me. Stay with me, damn it," pressing his hands against the wound just below the ribcage while Mark's breath rattled like broken glass, the deputy's fingers grabbing the front of Daniel's jacket as he rasped, "Danny, it wasn't supposed to happen like this." And Daniel leaned closer, his voice sharp with fear and anger as he demanded, "Who did this? Mark, tell me who the hell did this?" But Mark's gaze drifted toward the dark highway instead of answering, and then he whispered something that made Daniel's heart stop cold, because the word was a name Daniel had spent 15 years trying not to hear again, Luke. And then Mark's hand slipped away, his chest rising once more before falling still, the distant wail of sirens echoing down the empty highway, just as Claire burst out of the diner doorway, stopping when she saw Daniel kneeling in the blood beside the body, and the expression on her face changed from confusion to horror as she realized exactly who was lying there. The night suddenly feeling heavier than the mountains surrounding their small town of Silver Ridge, and Daniel felt a strange ringing silence fill his ears even as people shouted around him. Because the name Mark had spoken had torn open a memory he thought had been buried long ago, the name of Daniel's older brother, Luke Mercer, the man who had vanished after a robbery gone wrong 15 years earlier, and left Daniel to carry the shame of it alone, while the rest of the town whispered about the Mercer family as if they were cursed, and now, the name had returned with a bullet and a dead deputy lying in the parking lot. Hours later, the diner parking lot glowed under police floodlights while yellow tape fluttered in the cold wind. The asphalt stained dark where Mark had bled out, and Daniel stood beside his patrol truck, staring at the scene with the hollow focus of a man, forcing himself to remain steady, while grief clawed at the inside of his chest, and Sheriff's Office investigator Carla Ruiz walked up beside him, holding a clipboard, her voice low and careful as she said, "Danny, the coroner's on the way. We'll run ballistics once we get the bullet out." But Daniel barely heard her because the single word Mark had spoken still echoed in his mind like a gunshot that refused to fade. "Luke," and Carla followed his gaze toward the diner, before asking quietly, "You want to tell me what you're thinking?" And Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the cold air before he said, "Mark said a name before he died." And Carla's eyebrows lifted slightly. "What name?" Daniel hesitated for a moment that felt far longer than it was, because saying it out loud would make it real again. But finally, he answered, "Luke Mercer." And Carla went completely still, the significance of the name sinking in as she looked back toward the body. "Your brother?" Daniel nodded once, his jaw tightening, and Carla said carefully, "Danny. Luke disappeared 15 years ago. Nobody's seen him since that bank job." But Daniel shook his head. Mark wouldn't say a name unless he meant it, and Carla studied him for a long moment before replying, or someone wanted him to say it, the implication hanging heavily between them as wind rattled the loose diner sign above the door, and Daniel suddenly felt the familiar weight of the town's quiet judgment pressing against him again, the same way it had when Luke disappeared, and people started looking at Daniel like he might carry the same darkness inside him. Inside the diner, Claire sat alone in a booth, gripping a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, her knuckles pale while the waitress kept refilling the mug out of nervous habit, and when Daniel finally walked back inside, she looked up immediately, her voice trembling as she asked, "Is it true?" And Daniel knew exactly what she meant, even though she hadn't said it yet. "What did Mark say?" she whispered, and Daniel sat down across from her slowly, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm something deeper than his skin before answering. "He said Luke's name," and Claire's breath caught in her throat, her eyes filling with a mixture of fear and anger. "That's impossible," she said quietly. "Luke's gone." But Daniel replied, I know what Mark said. And the silence between them stretched while a truck rumbled past on the highway outside, the sound vibrating through the diner windows like distant thunder, until Claire finally leaned forward and whispered, "Danny, if Luke's really back, that means everything we thought about that night might be wrong." And Daniel's eyes lifted to meet hers, a shadow crossing his expression as he said, "Or worse, it means everything we feared about him was true." Because the memory of that long-ago robbery still haunted the town of Silver Ridge, the night two masked men had stormed the local bank, and one of them had shot a security guard before fleeing into the mountains, leaving Luke Mercer's abandoned truck behind on a dirt road and disappearing without a trace, while the other robber was found dead days later. And the town had quietly decided Luke must have been the one who pulled the trigger, even though nobody ever proved it. The following morning, the sky above Silver Ridge turned pale gray with approaching snow, as Daniel stood inside the sheriff's office, staring at a corkboard covered with photographs from the diner parking lot, Mark's patrol car, and the bullet casing found near the curb, and Carla stood beside him holding a file folder, while the office buzzed with subdued activity as deputies moved quietly around the room, every one of them carrying the weight of losing one of their own. And Carla said, "Ballistics says the bullet came from a .38 revolver, old weapon. No serial match yet." And Daniel nodded slowly before asking, "Witnesses?" And Carla flipped through her notes. "A trucker saw someone leaving the parking lot in a dark SUV right after the shot," she replied. "No plates, no clear description." And Daniel stared at the photograph of Mark lying on the asphalt, the image blurring slightly as anger mixed with grief inside him, because Mark had been more than a deputy. He had been the man who helped Daniel survive the shame of Luke's disappearance, the one who stood beside him when half the town believed the Mercer family was rotten from the inside out. Carla watched him quietly before saying, "Danny?" "About the name," he said, and Daniel finished the sentence for her. "You think he was mistaken?" But Carla shook her head slowly. "I think dying men sometimes say the thing that's been haunting them the longest," and Daniel frowned slightly. "Mark never thought Luke killed that guard," he said. "He told me that 100 times, and Carla nodded. "Exactly," she replied. "So, why would Luke's name be the last thing he said?" The question lingered like a shadow across the room, and Daniel suddenly felt the uneasy sense that Mark had been trying to tell him something more complicated than a simple accusation, something that reached back into the past and dragged the present along with it. And for the first time since the gunshot shattered the quiet of the diner parking lot, Daniel realized the investigation might not only be about who killed Mark, but about what really happened 15 years ago when Luke Mercer disappeared into the mountains and left behind a mystery that had quietly poisoned the town ever since. Later that afternoon, snow began to fall over Silver Ridge, coating the rooftops and empty sidewalks with a thin white layer, while Daniel drove slowly along the edge of town toward the abandoned farmhouse where the Mercer brothers had grown up, a place he hadn't visited in years, the wooden structure leaning slightly under the weight of neglect, while wind creaked the loose shutters against the walls. And when Daniel stepped out of the truck, he felt the strange sensation of stepping backward in time, because the smell of cold wood and dry grass carried memories of childhood arguments, family dinners, and the night everything fell apart, the night Luke disappeared after shouting something Daniel had never fully understood about being betrayed. And Daniel walked up the creaking porch steps before pushing open the door that hung loosely on its hinges, the interior dark except for pale light slipping through broken boards in the walls, and for several seconds he simply stood there, listening to the wind whistle through the empty house, until he heard a faint sound from deeper inside, the quiet scrape of a foot against wood, and Daniel's hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his belt as he called out sharply, "Sheriff's office. Whoever's in here, step out where I can see you." The silence stretching for a moment before a figure slowly emerged from the hallway shadows, a tall man with a beard and tired eyes wearing a worn leather jacket, his posture calm in a way that made Daniel's pulse slam violently against his ribs, because even after 15 years he recognized the shape of that face immediately, and the man looked at him with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow, before speaking in a voice Daniel had not heard since the night everything collapsed. "Hey, little brother," Luke Mercer said quietly. "You're going to want to hear why I came back." Daniel drew his pistol all the way and leveled it at Luke's chest, the old floorboards groaning under the shift of his weight, while snow hissed softly against the broken windows behind him, and for one suspended second neither man moved. Neither one blinking, both of them staring across 15 stolen years, as if the ruined farmhouse itself were holding its breath. "Put your hands where I can see them," Daniel said, his voice so flat it almost sounded calm, though his pulse was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Luke slowly lifted both hands to shoulder height, palms open, but the gesture did nothing to soften the shock of seeing him alive, real, standing in the hallway where their mother used to call them for dinner when they were boys. He looked older than Daniel remembered, and thinner too, his face lined by hard seasons and bad sleep. But he was unmistakably Luke Mercer. Claire's face flashed in Daniel's mind, then Mark's body on the diner asphalt, then the whispered name from a dying mouth. And anger rose so quickly it felt cleaner than grief. "You should have stayed dead," Daniel said. Luke flinched at that. Not like a man afraid of the gun, but like a brother who had expected hatred and still wasn't fully braced when it arrived. "I know how this looks," Luke said. "No, you don't," Daniel snapped. "Mark Ellison is dead. He said your name before he died. And now I find you hiding in this house like some ghost that crawled out of the walls. So let's not start with lies." Luke held Daniel's stare for a moment, then lowered his eyes briefly and said, "I'm not here because I killed Mark. I came back because Mark called me 2 weeks ago." That landed harder than Daniel expected. His arm stayed locked, but something in his expression changed. "That's impossible," he said. "Mark didn't even know where to find you." "He found me," Luke replied. "Or maybe he'd been looking longer than either of us knew." Daniel took 2 steps forward, the barrel of the pistol now close enough for Luke to see the black circle of it. "Tell me exactly what you mean." Luke exhaled slowly. "He tracked me through a man in Boise who used to run jobs across the state line. Mark told me he needed to talk off the record. Said he'd found something about the bank robbery. Something buried in old evidence that never made sense." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Why would he go to you instead of coming to me?" Luke gave a bitter half-smile that vanished almost immediately. "Because you wear the badge now, Danny. And because if what he found was true, he didn't know who in Silver Ridge he could trust." The words pressed into Daniel's mind with immediate force, because they carried a possibility he had not wanted to name even to himself, that Mark had been circling something bigger than one murder, something tied to the town, the department, maybe even people Daniel worked with every day. Luke seemed to read that fear in his face. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said. "I know I forfeited that a long time ago. I'm asking you to listen for 3 minutes before you cuff me or put me in the ground." Daniel stared at him, the silence inside the farmhouse, broken only by the wind threading through cracked boards and the distant groan of metal from the barn outside. For years he had imagined this moment in different forms. Luke in handcuffs, Luke in a grave, Luke on his knees, Luke innocent, Luke guilty, Luke begging, Luke laughing, but never this. Never a man standing still, asking for 3 minutes, speaking Mark's name like it belonged in the same sentence as truth. "Talk," Daniel said. Luke lowered his hands slowly when Daniel did not object, but he kept them visible. "Mark told me the dead robber from the bank job wasn't our mastermind. He was a decoy, a local burnout with gambling debt. Mark said he found discrepancies in the chain of custody logs and a missing witness statement from the security guard who survived. The statement named a third person, somebody in town, somebody who had access to the sheriff's office back then." Daniel's face went hard. "Who?" Luke shook his head. "Mark wouldn't say over the phone. He told me he wanted to show me the file in person. Said if he was right, I'd been set up and whoever framed me had stayed close enough all these years to keep it buried." Daniel's grip on the gun shifted. "Then why didn't you come straight to the sheriff's office?" "Because I know this town," Luke said. And now there was heat in his voice. "Years of it. I know what happened after I ran. I know what people believed. And if Mark thought someone inside law enforcement was involved, walking into the office would have gotten me killed or disappeared before I could say 2 words. Daniel wanted to reject that on instinct, but he couldn't. Not fully. Mark's last word, Carla's question, the gaps that had always existed around the old case. "So where were you last night?" Daniel asked. "At the old logging road east of Miller Pass. Mark told me to meet him there after dark." Luke swallowed, his eyes drifting past Daniel for a moment toward the front window, as if the memory itself stood outside in the snow. "He never showed. I waited 40 minutes. Then I saw headlights on the lower road and a truck I didn't recognize. I got spooked and left. Half an hour later I heard on a radio in a gas station outside town that a deputy had been shot at the diner." Daniel said nothing. He was trained to listen for holes, for rehearsed cadence, for details given too neatly, but Luke's account had the uneven edges of something remembered under strain, not polished in advance. That didn't make it true. It only made it harder to dismiss. "You ran 15 years ago," Daniel said. "Why?" Luke's eyes came back to his brother's face, and for the first time there was no guardedness in them. Only shame so deep it seemed to settle into the room like cold. "Because I was stupid, because I was scared, and because I believed the wrong man." Daniel felt the old rage returning. "Not good enough." "I know," Luke said. "The night of the robbery, I wasn't supposed to be inside the bank. I drove a truck for a man named Owen Pike. He owned a contracting company back then, did county bids, knew deputies, knew half the town council. He said he needed me for a pickup job, cash under the table. I was broke. Mom's medical bills were killing us, and I'd already been into enough stupid things that saying yes felt easier than saying no. Daniel heard the name and something shifted. Owen Pike still lived in Silver Ridge. He had built himself into one of those polished local businessmen people called solid because he donated to church repairs and Little League uniforms. Daniel had shaken his hand a dozen times over the years. Luke continued. When I realized it was the bank, I tried to back out. Pike told me I was already in. Said if I walked, he'd pin the whole thing on me. The other two went inside. I stayed in the truck. Then the shot went off. One of them came out bleeding. Pike wasn't where he said he'd be, and suddenly everything broke apart. The wounded guy kept yelling that we'd been sold out. We ditched the truck. He died in the hills that night. I wanted to come back, Danny. I swear to God I wanted to. But before dawn, Pike found me. Daniel's voice was low and dangerous now. Found you where? At the river shack near Thompson Creek, Luke said. He showed up with a deputy. Not in uniform, but I knew him. Roy Bannon. Daniel's stomach tightened. Roy Bannon had been dead 7 years, buried with honors after retiring from the office. You're saying Roy was in on it? I'm saying Roy told me if I came back, the town would hang the security guard on me, and Pike would make sure Mom lost the house too. He said the witness had named me already, which I believed. I was 23 and half out of my mind. I ran. Daniel felt disgust rising, but it was tangled in old grief. You left us with that. Yes, Luke said. I did. There's no version of this where I don't own that. The honesty of it hit harder than excuses would have. Daniel hated that part of himself registered it. So why disappear this long? He asked. Luke laughed once, but there was no humor in it. At first because I thought I'd be arrested if I came back. Then because every year that passed made it harder. Then because I heard Mom died while I was in Nevada under a different name. And after that I couldn't stand the idea of looking you or Claire in the face. I told myself staying gone was mercy. Truth is, it was cowardice. Daniel's arm finally began to ache from holding the gun steady, but he didn't lower it yet. The farmhouse smelled like dust, mold, and old winters, and the memories packed into it seemed to press at the walls, their father's silence at the table, their mother pretending not to notice when bills piled up, Luke teaching Daniel to throw a curveball in the yard out front, then Luke gone, and Daniel spending years trying to become the kind of man no one could compare to his brother. Mark had proof? Daniel asked. Luke nodded. He said he had copies of enough to reopen everything. Financial records too. County contracts. Payoffs routed through shell vendors. He thought Pike wasn't just covering up a robbery. He thought the robbery was part of a bigger pipeline. Money moved through construction bids and land purchases. He kept saying one phrase over and over. What phrase? Follow the flood money. Daniel stared at him. 2 years earlier, Silver Ridge had taken in state emergency funds after the river levee failed north of town. Owen Pike's company had won several repair contracts. Daniel remembered the closed-door meetings, the missing invoices that were blamed on clerical errors, the public arguments at council sessions. Why didn't Mark bring this to me? He said again, but this time it sounded less like accusation and more like a wound. Luke answered quietly. Maybe he meant to. Maybe he was trying to protect you until he knew how bad it was. Daniel lowered the gun at last, not because he trusted Luke, but because the shape of the night had changed. He holstered it in one hard motion and pulled a pair of cuffs from his belt anyway. Turn around. Luke obeyed without argument. The click of metal closing around his wrists sounded final in the empty house. You're coming in, Daniel said. You can tell this to Carla, on record. Fine, Luke said. But if Pike knows I'm back, we don't have long. Daniel took him out to the truck through wind-driven snow that stung his face like grit. And as he put Luke in the back seat, he saw movement near the tree line across the road, a dark shape slipping behind a stand of cottonwoods. His hand went back to his holster instantly. Stay down, he barked, though he couldn't tell whether he meant Luke or himself. He moved toward the ditch, boots crunching over frozen gravel, scanning the line of trees while the sky darkened toward late afternoon. But by the time he reached the fence, there was nothing there except swaying branches and a fresh set of tire tracks cutting away toward the county road. Someone had been watching. The certainty of it tightened every muscle in his body. Back at the office, Carla met them in the intake hall with 3 deputies behind her, all of them visibly stunned when Daniel brought Luke Mercer through the door in handcuffs. The room went silent in the way small departments do when news arrives all at once, and no one knows yet which reaction is safest. Carla recovered first. Interview room 2, she said. And Daniel caught the flash in her eyes that told him questions could wait until the door was closed. Half an hour later, Luke sat across a steel table under buzzing fluorescent light, while Carla recorded his statement, and Daniel stood against the wall with his arms folded, listening as Luke laid out the same story in fuller detail. Names, dates, places, small details about Roy Bannon's boots, about Owen Pike's pickup, about the river shack and the false invoices Mark had mentioned. Carla interrupted only to pin down specifics. She was good that way, never dramatic, never indulgent. When Luke finished, she sat back with the pen pressed against her lips and said, "If this is fabricated, it's the most committed lie I've heard in 20 years. It's not fabricated," Luke replied. Carla turned to Daniel. "We need to verify everything, quietly." He nodded. "Start with the old evidence logs and county contract records. Pull whatever Mark accessed in the last month." Carla glanced toward the mirrored glass, then back. "We've got a problem." "What?" Daniel asked. "Someone already signed into archives this morning from Bannon's old admin credentials." Daniel stared at her. "Bannon's dead." Exactly. The chill that moved through him had nothing to do with the weather outside. Someone with enough knowledge to use Roy Bannon's dormant access had been in their system after Mark died. Someone still inside. Or very close. Luke leaned forward in his cuffs. "You see now why Mark didn't trust the room?" Daniel didn't answer. He was already thinking ahead, already reordering faces and habits, and harmless comments from the past year, trying to identify which one might conceal a deeper rot. Carla shut off the recorder and said, "I want Luke held, but unofficially. Booking him puts his name in the system, and if Pike has eyes on dispatch, we lose any advantage." Daniel agreed immediately. They moved Luke to an unused storm shelter cell in the basement where old evidence overflow had once been kept, a locked concrete room with no windows and one steel door. It was crude, but secret. As Daniel closed Luke inside, Luke said, "Claire knows?" Daniel paused. "Not yet." "Tell her before someone else does," Luke said. "She has a right to hate me to my face." Daniel shut the door without replying, but the words followed him upstairs. By evening, Silver Ridge had settled under a deeper layer of snow, the streets dim and muffled. Christmas lights still hanging from a few porches even though the holiday was long over, their leftover glow making the town feel lonelier rather than festive. Daniel drove to Claire's house on Birch Avenue with a knot in his chest that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with family, because it had been easier to question suspects and bury deputies than to imagine telling his sister that the brother, whose disappearance had warped all of their lives, was sitting alive in a basement cell under the sheriff's office. Claire answered the door in jeans and a gray sweater, her dark hair pulled back loosely, the lines under her eyes deeper than they had been that morning. She took one look at Daniel's face and stepped aside without a word. Her daughter Ava was in the next room doing homework at the dining table, humming softly to herself, and Daniel waited until Claire led him into the kitchen before he spoke. "I found Luke," he said. Claire went still, one hand resting on the back of a chair. For a second, Daniel thought she might laugh from shock or deny hearing him, but instead, she closed her eyes and inhaled sharply through her nose, as if she'd spent 15 years rehearsing for a sentence she never believed would come. "Alive?" she asked. "Yes." When she opened her eyes again, they were wet and furious. "Where?" "At the farmhouse." Claire stared at him. "You mean he was there, today, in this town?" Daniel nodded. Claire took 2 steps back, then turned away and pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth. The kitchen light cast her shadow across the refrigerator door, making her look smaller than she was. "After Mom's funeral," she said, voice tight. "After all those birthdays, after every time Ava asked why she didn't have the same uncles other kids did, after you nearly bled yourself dry trying to hold this family together, he just walks back in now?" Daniel had no answer that could survive the truth of that anger. Claire turned to him again. "Why?" He gave her the essential parts. Mark's contact, the old robbery, Owen Pike, Roy Bannon. Enough to explain why Luke had resurfaced without pretending those reasons erased what he had done. Claire listened, with her arms folded across herself, eyes darkening more with every detail. "So Mark died because he found the truth," she said at last. "Maybe," Daniel replied, "and Luke says he was framed." Claire let out a brittle laugh. Luke says, Daniel felt his own conflict deepen, because hearing her doubt mirrored his, and yet he had seen the broken edges in Luke's face, the shame that didn't look manufactured. "I don't know what's true yet," he said, "but enough of it fits that I can't ignore him." Claire looked past him toward the dining room, where Ava's pencil scratched against paper. "Does Ava know he exists?" she asked. "She knows I had another brother," Daniel said. "That's all." Claire shook her head slowly. "Keep it that way until you know whether he's a ghost or a man." The phrase lodged in Daniel's mind. Ghost or man. That was exactly the shape of it. Before he left, Claire said, without turning to face him, "If he really is innocent of what happened back then, that doesn't make him innocent of leaving." Daniel stood in the doorway with one hand on the knob and said quietly, "I know." Back at the office, the building was darker than usual, most of the lights off, the night shift thin because grief had disrupted normal schedules. Carla was alone in records, computer glow painting sharp shadows across her face as she sorted through scanned ledgers and access logs. "I found something," she said before Daniel even spoke. He stepped beside her desk. On the screen were county payment records tied to Pike Contracting and a smaller vendor called High Mesa Materials. Carla tapped the name. High Mesa doesn't exist. Not legally. No tax registration, no operating address, no staff. But it received almost $300,000 across flood repair subcontracts over 18 months. Daniel's expression tightened. Who approved them? Carla clicked deeper into the audit trail. Digitally? Roy Bannon's credentials on the early payments. Later ones approved through county procurement. But this part is interesting. She opened a second file. Mark requested access to these records 3 times in the last 6 weeks. Each request was flagged, then cleared by Undersheriff Tom Greeley. Daniel stared at the name. Tom Greeley had been with the office nearly 30 years. He had helped mentor Daniel after Mark. He attended every church fundraiser in town. He sent casseroles when families lost someone. He was the kind of man people described as steady because they couldn't imagine him any other way. No, Daniel said automatically. Not because logic supported it, but because some betrayals hit the mind too hard to admit on first impact. Carla's voice stayed neutral. Maybe not. Maybe he was procedural. Maybe someone used his login. But there's more. She handed Daniel a printout of radio tower pings tied to Mark's department-issued phone. Mark was at Miller Pass last night, just like Luke said, for 11 minutes. Then he left. 16 minutes later, he was at the diner. During that gap, he exchanged 2 calls with Greeley. Daniel felt something harden inside him. Not certainty, not yet, but a colder, more functional anger than grief. Where is Tom now? Carla checked the wall clock. Home, supposedly. His wife told dispatch he turned in early. Daniel looked at her, and the decision passed silently between them. No uniforms, no noise, no warrants yet, just truth, if they could catch it before it moved again. They drove in Carla's unmarked SUV across town through narrow streets glossed with snow, headlights sliding over dark porches and iced fences, until they reached Greeley's house near the Methodist church. The place looked still from the outside, only one lamp on in the front room and no visible movement. But when Carla killed the engine, Daniel saw at once what was wrong. Tire tracks. Fresh, cutting out of the driveway within the last hour. "He's gone," Daniel said. Carla was already on the radio, low and controlled, calling for quiet surveillance on county roads without naming the target over open channels. They approached the front porch with hands near their weapons, and Daniel knocked once, then harder. Tom Greeley's wife, Linda, opened the door in a robe, confusion on her face giving way to nervousness the moment she saw who stood there. "Daniel? Carla? What is it?" Daniel kept his tone respectful. "We need to speak with Tom." Her eyes flickered. "Just once, but enough." "He's asleep," she said. Carla asked gently. "Mrs. Greeley, did he leave tonight?" Linda's fingers tightened around the edge of the door. "He went for a drive," she said. "Said he couldn't settle." Daniel felt the answer land like a confirmation. "Did he say, where?" Linda shook her head, but tears were already filling her eyes. "What has he done?" she whispered, and the question itself said more than any denial could have. Daniel looked at Carla. The final arc of the case was beginning to gather shape now, not yet at the ending window, but close enough that every next move would carry consequences too large to undo. Carla stepped aside to make the call for a bolo, while Daniel stood on Tom Greeley's porch watching snow fall across the empty street, knowing with a sick certainty that whatever truth Mark died trying to bring into the light had started moving. And once the town saw it clearly, Silver Ridge would not survive, unchanged. By the time Daniel and Carla got back to the sheriff's office, the building felt less like a place of law than a house with a cracked foundation. Every door and fluorescent-lit hallway suddenly suspect, every familiar voice carrying the possibility of deception, and Daniel hated how quickly his mind had begun to rearrange the faces around him into categories of threat and uncertainty, because that was what betrayal did when it got inside an institution. It made loyalty feel naive. Carla shut the office door behind them and locked it before saying, "We need to control information right now. If Greeley is involved, we assume he knows procedure, evidence storage, patrol routes, all of it." Daniel nodded once, staring through the glass toward the bullpen where 2 deputies were finishing reports under the dimmed lights. both men young enough that he could still remember their academy field evaluations. "Who do you trust?" Carla asked. It was a simple question, and somehow the hardest one of the night. Daniel let the silence sit for several seconds before answering, "You. Maybe Jenkins on nights. That's it." Carla accepted that without offense. "Then we keep it small." She moved toward the records room again, already thinking in clean lines while Daniel remained still for a moment, his hands braced on the edge of a desk, as exhaustion pressed against the back of his eyes. He was tired in the deepest sense, not physically alone but morally, like the ground of his life had shifted an inch and his body could not yet compensate. Mark dead, Luke alive, Greeley running, the old robbery poisoning the present. He thought of Claire standing in her kitchen with her arms crossed over herself, as if trying to hold in 15 years of anger, and he wondered whether any truth they found now could repair what time had already destroyed. Probably not, but that had never been the point of truth. The point was to stop rot before it spread farther. Carla returned with a sealed evidence envelope and dropped it on the desk in front of him. "Mark's locker," she said. "Jenkins found this tucked behind the spare radio batteries. No chain logged. He must have hidden it there." Daniel opened the envelope carefully and slid out a flash drive, 2 folded photocopied ledgers, and a yellow sticky note with one line written in Mark's blocky hand. "If anything happens to me, ask Pike, who bought the Miller property under Linda S." Daniel read the note twice. "Linda S?" Carla asked. "Could be Linda Greeley," Daniel said, though even saying it left a bitter taste in his mouth because it pulled Greeley's wife, maybe knowingly and maybe not, into a circle that was already tight with damage. Carla pointed to the photocopies. They were land transfer records from 5 years earlier. A rundown parcel near Miller Pass had been purchased through a holding company and then quietly rezoned after the flood repairs began. Daniel's eyes moved over the names and notations until he stopped at the line item for utilities access approved through a county discretionary fund. "This wasn't just fraud," he said. "This land mattered for some reason." Carla nodded. "Storage, maybe. Equipment, cash, records, something off book." Daniel looked at the flash drive in his palm. "Can you open it on an isolated machine?" "Already setting one up," Carla said. 10 minutes later, they were standing in the tiny training room behind the dispatch area, while an old desktop hummed to life, disconnected from the network. Carla inserted the drive and both of them leaned toward the screen as folders populated one by one. Contract scans, bank routing data, archived call logs, photographs. Then a video file, stamped from a highway gas station security camera 2 months earlier. Carla clicked it open. Grainy footage filled the screen. A snowy forecourt at dusk, 1 gas pump, a coffee kiosk, and then Mark stepping into frame, wearing plain clothes and a knit cap pulled low. He was speaking to another man just outside the camera's audio range. The man turned slightly, enough for his profile to catch the light, and Daniel felt the air leave him. Tom Greeley. Mark reached into his coat and handed Greeley a manila envelope. Greeley took it, glanced around, then walked out of frame. The video ended 20 seconds later. "Why would Mark give him anything?" Carla whispered. Daniel stared at the frozen image. Maybe he was testing him. Maybe he didn't know yet. Carla scrubbed back. Or maybe this is before he knew Greeley was the leak. Daniel's eyes dropped to another folder, labeled audio. Inside were 3 phone recordings. The first was static-heavy and short, Mark's voice saying, "You can't keep sitting on this, Tom. If Pike goes down, he's not going alone." The second had only Greeley's voice, thin and tense. "Meet me in person. No more on county lines." The third was barely audible, but after Carla boosted the gain, Luke's name became clear. Mark was saying, "If Luke Mercer is alive, he deserves to hear this before somebody buries it again." Daniel closed his eyes for a second. It was one thing to hear Luke claim Mark contacted him. It was another to hear Mark say it. The room seemed smaller now, the overhead fluorescent buzz louder. Carla saved copies to a separate drive and said, "This is enough to bring in state investigators." Daniel did not answer immediately. Bringing in the state would be correct. It would also ignite the entire town by morning. Every local secret dragged into public light. Every rumor turned loose. Claire's name, Luke's name, his own judgment questioned, Mark's death feeding the fire. Necessary, yes. But the decision carried a weight beyond procedure, because once the state arrived, Daniel would no longer control the shape of what happened to his family. He hated himself for still caring about that when a deputy was dead. "We call them," he said finally. "But before dawn, quiet channel, and before that we find Greeley if we can." Carla studied him. "You think he'll run to Pike?" "If Pike's still breathing, yes. And if Pike decides Greeley is now a liability?" Daniel met her eyes. "Then we may find one body before we find the other." They set the call to the State Bureau through Carla's personal cell, using an old academy contact she trusted, giving only enough for urgent assistance without broadcasting details. Then Daniel went downstairs to the basement cell. Luke was sitting on the narrow bench with his forearms on his knees, head bowed, looking less like a fugitive than a man who had finally run out of miles. He looked up when Daniel entered. "You believe me now?" he asked. Daniel remained by the door. "I believe Mark reached out to you. I believe Greeley is dirty. That's not the same thing as absolving you." Luke nodded once. "Fair." Daniel held up the land records. "What's on the Miller property?" Luke's face changed slightly, not into fear exactly, but into recognition. "Pike used to talk about it years ago. Said remote land was better than vaults because nobody audits empty hills." Daniel waited. Luke frowned, thinking back. He had a storage shed there once, maybe more than one. He kept cash, tools, maybe weapons, whatever couldn't be explained in town. Daniel said. "You never went?" "Once," Luke replied. "At night. I stayed in the truck. There was an old feed building and a fuel tank. That's all I remember." Daniel weighed the answer, then asked the question that had been circling him all evening from a different angle. "Why did Mark trust you enough to call?" Luke looked down at his cuffed hands for a moment, then said quietly, "Because out of everyone connected to that robbery, I'm the only one who never profited from it." The sentence settled between them with surprising force. Daniel thought of Pike's company, Greeley's years of comfortable county service, the vanished contracts, the land purchases, and then Luke living under false names in places nobody remembered, carrying his own punishment in another form. It did not erase the abandonment, but it changed its outline. "Claire knows you're alive," Daniel said. Luke's shoulders stiffened. "Did she ask to see me?" "No." Luke gave a sad little nod. "That tracks." Daniel almost left then, but something stopped him. "Mom waited for you until the end," he said, the words coming harder than he expected. Luke shut his eyes. Daniel continued anyway, because if pain was already in the room, there was no reason to spare it. "She kept the porch light on every storm night for 3 years. She told people it was habit. It wasn't. It was you." Luke's face folded inward, and for the first time since Daniel found him, his composure broke. He covered his mouth with one hand and turned away, shoulders tightening with the effort not to make sound. Daniel stood there, feeling no satisfaction at all, only the blunt ache of finally saying something that had sat inside him for more than a decade. When Luke could speak again, he said, almost to the wall, "I know I don't get forgiveness for that," Daniel answered. "No." Then he left, locking the door behind him. Just before dawn, Jenkins came in from the lot carrying 2 coffees, and the kind of cautious expression people wear when they know they have been trusted with something dangerous. Daniel had chosen him because Jenkins was competent, quiet, and knew enough not to be welded into the old alliances of the department. They sat in the dark conference room, while Carla pinned maps to the wall. "We've got a ping," Carla said. Greeley's personal cell hit a tower south of Miller Pass at 2:11 a.m., then went dark. She tapped the map near the old Miller property. Daniel felt a grim kind of confirmation. He's going to Pike. Jenkins took that in without theatrical reaction, which made Daniel trust him more. "How do you want to play it?" Daniel looked at the map. Snow made the upper road risky, but it also narrowed movement. Too much delay, and they might lose both men. Too much force, and whoever was cornered might choose bullets. "Quiet approach," he said. "No lights until we're close. Jenkins, perimeter on the south side. Carla with me." As they geared up, the office remained mostly still. The town outside held in the brittle blue-gray hour before sunrise, when everything feels exposed and unfinished. Daniel checked his sidearm, then Mark's old spare flashlight that he had taken from the locker by instinct, and for one brief moment memory hit him so hard he had to grip the equipment table to steady himself. Mark laughing in the range lot last summer. Mark saying, "You overthink everything, Danny." Mark dead on frozen asphalt. Grief was strange that way. It did not arrive in clean speeches. It arrived while fastening a holster or hearing a coffee lid snap into place, and suddenly the missing person was everywhere. Carla saw his expression but said nothing. She only handed him the body armor. The drive to Miller Pass took 30 minutes through snow-packed roads lined with dark pines and abandoned summer cabins. Dawn was only beginning to bruise the eastern sky, a pale strip behind the mountains, and the unmarked SUV moved without sirens, tires whispering over the frozen road. Daniel watched the landscape and thought about the way towns preserve their myths. Silver Ridge liked to believe corruption belonged elsewhere, in cities, in television, in old machine politics counties 2 states away. But rot in a small town was often easier, not harder, because it wore the face of men who knew your mother's first name, men who shook hands at church picnics and stood beside you at funerals. By the time you saw it clearly, It had usually been there for years. They cut the engine half a mile from the Miller property and continued on foot, cold air slashing at their lungs as they moved between pines. Snow muted their steps but also magnified small sounds, a branch flexing, metal ticking as it cooled, the far-off growl of an idling engine. When they reached the ridgeline overlooking the old feed building, Daniel dropped to one knee and raised binoculars. A pickup truck sat beside the building. Another vehicle was parked near the fuel tank. One shape moved near the doorway. Another stood beside the truck, smoking. Too visible, Daniel whispered. Carla studied them through her scope. One is Greeley, she said after a moment. The other's Pike. Daniel felt his chest tighten with a complicated surge of fury and vindication. Owen Pike looked exactly like the kind of man who had gotten away with too much for too long, even at distance. Expensive coat, easy stance, a man whose confidence had been fed by years of not being stopped. Daniel radioed Jenkins into position, then waited, watching Greeley pace near the doorway. Something about the older man's posture disturbed him. Not calm, not controlled, frayed. Pike said something Daniel couldn't hear. Greeley threw the cigarette into the snow and answered with a sharp gesture. They were arguing. Carla whispered, "Could be turning on each other." Daniel nodded. "Good." They closed the distance in a slow crescent, using equipment piles and the collapsed side wall of the feed building for cover, until voices became audible over the wind. Pike was saying, "You should have left the kid dead in the parking lot if you were going to lose your nerve after." Greeley answered, "Mark wasn't supposed to push it that far. He kept digging. You said Mercer was gone." Daniel felt every muscle in his body lock. Pike gave a short, contemptuous laugh. "Mercer ran because he was weak. That part held just fine." Greeley stepped closer, voice cracking under controlled panic. "Now Daniel's sniffing around and Luke Mercer is back in town." Pike's head turned sharply. "What? You heard me." There was a pause, then Pike said, "Lower. Then you should have killed him too." Daniel did not wait for more. He rose from cover and shouted, "Sheriff's office. Hands where I can see them." The effect was immediate and violent. Greeley staggered backward in shock, while Pike moved with terrifying speed toward the truck door. Carla fired first, one controlled round into the engine block, metal exploding and the truck lurching uselessly as steam hissed up. Jenkins came in from the south flank, shouting commands. Greeley dropped to his knees with his hands half raised, but Pike drew a pistol from under his coat and fired twice toward Daniel's position, rounds punching splinters out of the collapsed wall. Daniel returned fire once, forcing Pike behind the truck. The mountains swallowed the shots and threw them back in echoes. "Pike!" Daniel shouted. "It's over." Pike laughed from behind the truck, the sound carrying oddly in the cold. "Boys like you always think there's an over." Then he yelled toward Greeley, "Get up, Tom. Don't die pathetic." But Greeley did not move. He was shaking visibly now, hands high, face gray. "I'm done," he shouted back. "I'm done with you." Pike's answer was another gunshot, not at Daniel but at Greeley, and only Carla's shove sent Greeley sideways into the snow before the bullet could hit center mass. It tore through Greeley's shoulder instead, spinning him down with a cry. Daniel surged forward then, closing the angle while Jenkins laid covering fire into the truck's rear panel. Pike broke from cover and ran toward the feed building. Daniel chased him through drifting snow, boots slipping once on packed ice before catching again, his breath ragged in his ears. Inside the building, the air smelled of old hay, oil, and cold rust. Light pushed through the warped boards in sharp, pale lines, and for a moment, Daniel saw nothing. Then a shadow moved above. Pike had climbed the loft stairs. "You don't know what your brother was," Pike called down. "You think guilt makes him honest?" Daniel climbed after him, weapon up, the staircase groaning beneath each step. "I know what you are," he said. Pike appeared at the far end of the loft, revolver in hand, the morning light making his face look both ordinary and monstrous at once. "You know nothing," Pike snapped. "This county would have bled out years ago if men like me hadn't kept it afloat." Daniel almost laughed at the size of the lie. "You stole from it." "I used what was available," Pike shot back. "Everyone does. Roy did. Tom did. Your sainted Mark would have too if he'd had the spine." Daniel's finger tightened against the frame of his pistol. "Not the trigger yet, but close. Mark died trying to stop you." Pike's expression shifted into something uglier, more intimate. "Mark died because he thought being good made him safe." He raised the revolver. Daniel fired first. The shot cracked through the loft and Pike jerked backward, the gun flying from his hand as he crashed against the railing. For one terrifying second, it seemed he might keep his balance, but the old wood split beneath him and he went through it, falling hard to the ground floor in a burst of splintered boards and dust. Daniel raced down the stairs and reached him as Pike struggled weakly amid shattered timber, blood spreading fast through his coat. Pike looked up at him, trying for defiance. But what showed through instead was disbelief, the shocked outrage of a man who had always assumed consequences belonged to others. Daniel kicked the fallen revolver away. "Call medics," he shouted to Carla, though one glance told him it might not matter. Pike coughed blood onto his chin and stared past Daniel toward the doorway where dawn light was widening. "It was never about the bank," he whispered. Daniel crouched, grabbing the front of Pike's coat. "Then tell me what it was about." Pike's breath hitched. "Land, water rights, contracts. Old Roy said nobody notices theft if you wrap it in emergency." His eyes fluttered. Mercer boy was just convenient. Daniel felt the words go through him like a blade. Convenient. That was what Luke had been to these men, what the Mercer family had become. A shield made of rumor and class and bad choices. Something easy to blame because powerful men knew the town would believe it. "Who else?" Daniel demanded. Pike tried to answer, but blood filled his mouth, and the sound came out wet and useless. Seconds later, his body slackened. Daniel stayed crouched there longer than necessary, breathing hard, rage and relief and emptiness crashing together inside him. Outside, Greeley was alive, barely conscious, pressure bandage on his shoulder, while Carla spoke into the radio for medevac. Jenkins was sweeping the property. "You need to see this," he called from behind the feed building. Daniel followed him around to a half-collapsed shed buried in drifts. Inside were metal lockboxes, old rifles, and file bins wrapped in plastic. Carla arrived beside him and let out a low breath. "This is it," she said. "Their archive." There were contract originals, payoff ledgers, photos of county projects billed but never completed. Even a sealed envelope containing the missing witness statement from the security guard in the old bank case. Daniel opened it with gloved hands and read the first lines while snow swirled through the broken shed wall. The witness had described a man with a scar over his left eyebrow, directing the robbery from outside. Owen Pike had that scar. Daniel closed the paper slowly. 15 years of accusations shifted in that instant, not erased, because Luke still ran, still left, still broke the family by disappearing. But the central lie of the town had finally cracked open. By mid-morning, state investigators were on scene, cruisers and evidence vans climbing the road under a sky that had cleared into brutal winter blue. They took over with the efficient detachment of people arriving at the end of someone else's long nightmare. Daniel gave statements. Carla gave statements. Greeley was flown to Billings under guard. He would live. Pike was bagged and removed. The shed contents were catalogued. Procedure moved forward. Yet through it all, Daniel felt strangely dislocated, as if the machinery of justice were grinding on around him, while some older part of his life still stood frozen in the ruined farmhouse where Luke had said, "Hey, little brother." They were not near the ending window yet, not fully, and Daniel knew the next consequences would be harder than the gunfire had been, because bullets ended action, but truth began aftermath. When he returned to town that afternoon, reporters were already gathering at the edge of the courthouse lawn, tipped off by scanners and rumor. Silver Ridge's quiet was over. He parked behind the sheriff's office and sat in the truck for a full minute before getting out, looking at the town he had spent years serving and wondering how much of it had actually known, how much had guessed and preferred not to ask. Inside, Carla met him near booking with tired eyes and said, "State wants Luke transferred tonight for protective custody." Daniel absorbed that, then asked, "Before or after Claire sees him?" Carla hesitated. "That's up to Claire." Daniel nodded. Upstairs, through the front windows, he could see townspeople already gathering in little knots on the sidewalk, talking with the hungry, frightened energy of people who sense their shared story is about to be rewritten. And somewhere beneath that noise, beneath procedure and scandal and the coming statements to the press, one quieter truth remained unresolved, harder than the case itself. Luke Mercer had not just come back to clear his name, he had come back to face the family he abandoned, and Daniel knew with a cold certainty that no evidence file in any box would tell them how to live with that. Daniel stood outside the basement, holding room for several seconds before opening the door, hearing nothing on the other side except the dull hum of old ventilation and the faint metallic tick of pipes warming somewhere behind the concrete walls. And he realized, with a sudden, unwelcome clarity, that he had been more prepared to arrest his brother than to speak to him as a human being after learning the town had lied about him for 15 years. Luke was on the bench again, elbows on knees, staring at the floor in the posture of a man who had spent most of his adult life waiting for consequences. He looked up when Daniel entered, reading something in his face immediately. "Pike?" he asked. Daniel shut the door behind him. "Dead." Luke absorbed that in silence, not triumphantly, not even with obvious relief, only with the complicated emptiness that comes when a person who shaped your ruin is suddenly beyond your reach forever. And Greeley? He asked after a moment. Alive. Under guard. Luke leaned back against the wall, rubbing one cuffed wrist with the thumb of his free hand, and Daniel saw years of old instinct flicker behind his eyes, all the reflexes of a man conditioned to expect a system to turn against him first and explain later. State Bureau's taking over, Daniel said. They found the missing witness statement. Pike's named. Roy and Greeley buried it. Luke shut his eyes briefly. So that part's over. Daniel almost corrected him, but he understood what Luke meant. That part. The lie that made him the gunman. The lie that let everyone build their version of the Mercer family around shame and suspicion. But over was not the same thing as healed, and Daniel knew enough about wounds to know that some of them only start hurting properly once the pressure on them changes. Claire can see you before they move you, he said. Luke's eyes opened again, and for the first time that day, Daniel saw something like fear in him that had nothing to do with arrest or violence. She agreed. I didn't say that. Luke gave a small, humorless nod. Fair enough. Daniel remained standing. I haven't told her the whole case is confirmed yet. I figured that was mine to say after she sees you, not before. Luke studied him for a second. Why? Daniel looked at the stained concrete wall rather than at his brother. Because whatever else you did, I'm not letting the town get to her first. Not again. The sentence sat in the room between them, larger than either man seemed ready to touch, and then Luke said quietly, You always were better at staying. Daniel let out a dry breath through his nose. That wasn't virtue. Somebody had to clean up. He regretted the sharpness the second it left his mouth, but not enough to take it back. Luke accepted it with the stillness of a man who knew he had earned worse. You're right, he said. I left you with all of it. Daniel looked at him then, really looked, and the resemblance that age had altered but not erased seemed almost cruel. The same dark hair now threaded with gray, the same stubborn line of the jaw, their father's eyes in two different lives. Do you know what it was like? Daniel asked, and it came out flatter than anger, flatter even than accusation, which somehow made it more dangerous. Not the town, not the deputies, not strangers. Mom. Claire. Me. Do you know what it was like to watch Mom pretend every phone call might be you? To stand by her hospital bed while she still believed maybe you'd come through the door? To hear Claire lie to her kid because the truth was too ugly and too unfinished? Luke's mouth tightened. No, he said. Not fully. I can imagine pieces. That's not the same. Daniel nodded once because that, at least, was honest. No, it's not. He left then, because staying longer would have forced something out of him he could not yet afford. Upstairs, the office had turned into a controlled siege of phones, paperwork, and rumor management. 2 state investigators had taken over the briefing room. Reporters were being held at the perimeter. Carla was at the front counter shutting down speculative questions from local council members who suddenly wanted updates. The town's pulse had shifted from sleepy certainty to open appetite, and Daniel could almost feel the collective hunger for names, for scandal, for an explanation dramatic enough to let everyone pretend they themselves had not helped sustain the lie by repetition and silence. He found Claire's number and stood alone in the evidence hallway before calling. She picked up on the second ring. What now? She asked, and Daniel heard at once from her voice that she had already seen something online or heard something through neighbors. It's true, he said. They found the witness statement. Pike and Greeley were in it. Mark was right. There was a long pause, and when Claire spoke again, her voice had changed. Not softer, more stunned. So Luke didn't shoot that guard. No. But he was there. Yes. Another pause. Daniel could hear Ava in the background asking for help with something, her child's voice moving faintly through the normal sounds of a house, still trying to be ordinary. Claire came back on, a little more quietly, and Mark died because he uncovered it. Looks that way. He waited, knowing there was no clean sequence for what came next. Finally, Claire asked the question that mattered most and least at the same time. Do you think Luke came back because he wanted to make this right? Or because he finally ran out of places to hide? Daniel leaned his shoulder against the hallway wall. I think both can be true. Claire let out a low breath. Yeah, she said. That sounds like our family. He closed his eyes. Will you come see him? She did not answer right away. When she did, the words were slow and careful. Not for him. For me. I'm not carrying another 15 years of unfinished anger because he couldn't look us in the face, Daniel said. I'll be here. No, Claire replied. I need to do it without you in the room. That stung in a way he had half expected. Okay, he said. Bring her? Claire asked suddenly. Daniel knew she meant Ava. That's your call. Claire's voice sharpened. No. Don't put that on me like you're being neutral. Should she meet him? Daniel looked through the small window, into the bullpen, where deputies he had known for years were now speaking softly to state agents under fluorescent lights that made everyone seem tired and washed out. He thought of childhood photographs that still sat in a box at Claire's house. Luke holding Claire on his shoulders at the county fair. Luke teaching Daniel to bait a fishing hook. Luke before fear and bad choices hardened into absence. "Not yet," Daniel said. "She shouldn't walk into that room before we know what place he'll really have in our lives, if any." Claire was silent for 2 beats, then said, "Good. That's what I thought too." She would come in an hour. After the call, Daniel went outside into the brittle cold, needing air that did not smell like old paper, gun oil, and stress. The courthouse lawn across the street was crowded now with satellite vans from Billings and one from Cheyenne, bright logos glaring against the snow. Small-town corruption was catnip to regional news, especially when it came wrapped in a dead deputy, missing contracts, and a prodigal son tied to an old robbery. Daniel watched the crew set up and felt a wave of disgust so broad it nearly numbed him. Not because the story should stay hidden, it should not. Mark deserved exposure. The truth deserved daylight. But spectacle was a poor substitute for mourning, and he could already imagine the language that would be used. Scandal, disgrace, buried secrets, local dynasty of lies, as though families were plot devices, and not people who had to wake up inside the wreckage after the cameras moved on. Carla stepped out beside him, zippered into a heavy coat, holding 2 paper cups. She handed him one without comment. Coffee had become their common language over the last day. "State wants a joint press statement at 4, she said. Daniel accepted the cup. "You doing it with me? Unless you want the pleasure alone." He glanced at her. "I don't want any pleasure associated with this." Carla nodded toward the courthouse lawn. "Then think of it as cutting the rumor supply before it gets creative." Daniel almost smiled, despite himself. That was Carla's gift. Not optimism. Function. She made reality feel more navigable by refusing to decorate it. "Claire's coming," he said. Carla looked at him over the rim of her cup. "To see Luke?" "Yeah. You okay with that?" Daniel laughed once under his breath. "No, but I think not being okay has stopped being a useful standard." Carla leaned against the railing. "Mark used to say that about budget meetings." The mention of his name landed quietly, not like a blow this time, but like a bruise pressed by accident. Daniel stared across the street at the accumulating press crews. "I keep thinking he should be here for this part," he said. "Being smug, probably." Carla's mouth tilted slightly. "Very smug." He nodded. He'd have hated how right he was. He usually did. The silence that followed was companionable, heavy but not awkward. And Daniel realized how rare that had become in his life, to stand beside someone and not perform steadiness. "Do you ever think," he said after a while, "that this town picks its stories before it picks its facts?" Carla did not answer immediately. "Every town does," she said at last. "Big ones just have better PR." Claire arrived just before noon in her blue pickup. Alone. She moved through the lobby with her shoulders set in the rigid posture Daniel recognized from childhood, the one that meant she had already made herself a promise not to cry in public. She stopped in front of him, but did not hug him. "Where is he?" she asked. Daniel led her downstairs, the concrete steps amplifying each footfall. At the holding room door she paused. "How bad does he look?" Daniel considered the question. "Like someone who's been living with himself." Claire gave the smallest nod, then said, "Stay out here." He unlocked the door and stepped aside. Luke stood when Claire entered. For a second, none of them moved, and then Daniel pulled the door almost shut, leaving it latched but not fully sealed, enough to give privacy without distance. He could not hear everything, only pieces at first, voices rising and falling through cinder block and metal. Claire's came sharp and low. Luke's, softer. Then, after a minute, the cadence changed, less attack, more exposure, and despite himself, Daniel drifted closer until the words became clearer through the narrow gap. Claire was saying, "You don't get to tell me you were trying to protect us. Do you understand that? Men always say that after they disappear. It's vanity. You protected yourself from shame, and we paid for it." Luke answered, "Yes." No excuse. Just yes. Claire's voice cracked suddenly, and that sound hurt Daniel more than anything else all day because Claire rarely let anything crack. "Mom died waiting for you." A long silence followed. Then Luke said, almost too quietly to hear, "I know." Claire let out a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "No, you know it as information. I know it as a room." Daniel closed his eyes. Even without seeing her, he knew exactly what she meant. Hospital curtains. Machines. The false little rallies at the end, their mother turning toward every footstep. After another stretch of silence, Luke said, "There isn't a sentence I can give you that fixes what I did." Claire answered immediately, "Good. Because if you had one, I'd hate you for trying it." Then the room went quiet long enough that Daniel almost knocked, but he stopped himself. This was theirs, not his, to mediate, not his to rescue. When Claire finally came out 23 minutes later, her eyes were red but dry, and something about the set of her mouth had loosened. Not into peace, not remotely, but into the shape of anger, no longer trapped behind glass. "He asked about Ava," she said. Daniel waited. "I told him maybe someday, if he earns a version of honesty that lasts longer than a conversation." Daniel searched her face. How did he take that? Claire looked back at the closed door, like a man hearing terms for parole from a prison he built himself. She turned to leave, then stopped. "He told me something else." "What?" "The night he ran, he came to the hospital parking lot first. Mom was already inside with Dad's first stroke. He sat across the street in the truck for an hour and couldn't make himself go in." Daniel felt the information hit him in a different place than the rest. Not absolving, not even softening, but complicating. "Why tell you now?" he asked. Claire shrugged, tired suddenly. Maybe because he's finally out of excuses. Maybe because he wants somebody to know he wasn't completely heartless. "I honestly don't care yet which." She touched his arm then, briefly, and the contact startled him by its tenderness. "Danny, whatever happens with him, don't confuse solving the case with solving the family. They're not the same job." Then she left. Daniel stood in the hallway for a while after that, hearing her words settle into him like cold water. They're not the same job. It was exactly the kind of sentence Claire had always been good at. The one that took the messiest truth in a room and pinned it to the wall where nobody could avoid it. By mid-afternoon, the State Bureau had formalized control of the criminal investigation. Search warrants went out on county offices. Financial crimes teams were inbound. The sheriff's office itself was being treated carefully, not raided but scrutinized. Every old access credential, evidence transfer, and discretionary account now part of a widening web. Daniel sat through 3 recorded interviews and 1 briefing with a state supervisor whose tone was respectful but unmistakably alert to the possibility that local loyalties had tainted more than they knew. That, too, was fair. If he had been on the other side of it, he would have assumed the same. Yet every procedural question pressed on his pride like grit in a wound. Had he missed signs? Had he mistaken familiarity for integrity? Had Mark kept things from him because he feared not just corruption around Daniel, but blindness within him? That thought bothered him most, because there was no clean defense against it. By the time the press statement began at 4, the winter light had already started to fade. Daniel stood on the courthouse steps beside Carla and Special Agent Beth Harmon from the State Bureau. Microphones clustered at chest level, camera lights turning the falling snow into white streaks. He gave the facts without embellishment. Deputy Mark Ellison had been killed in connection with an ongoing criminal investigation. Evidence recovered this morning had linked the killing to a broader pattern of corruption involving county contracts and long-suppressed records in the Mercer bank robbery case. One suspect, Owen Pike, was deceased following an armed confrontation. Former Undersheriff Tom Greeley was in custody under guard. The investigation was active. More arrests were possible. He did not say Luke's name. Not yet. Reporters shouted questions anyway. "Sheriff Mercer, is it true your brother has been cleared? Did your office conceal evidence? How long has corruption existed inside Silver Ridge law enforcement? Did Deputy Ellison fear for his life before he died?" Daniel answered only what he could. When a reporter from Billings yelled, "Sheriff, do you believe your family was targeted because they were easy to blame?" The question hung in the air with a cruel kind of precision. Daniel looked out at the cameras and the gathered townspeople behind them, some curious, some shaken, some defensive, some perhaps already revising history in their own heads. "I believe this town accepted a story before it demanded the truth," he said. "And I believe a good man died trying to correct that. The rest will come out in the investigation." It was not a dramatic answer, but it was the truest one he had. That night, after the cameras were gone, and the office had quieted into the strained fatigue of people working past the point of freshness, Daniel drove to the cemetery on the North Hill. He had not planned to. His body simply turned that direction when the shift ended. Snow crusted over the grass between the headstones, and the wind off the ridge carried the smell of pine and ice. He parked near the family plot and walked first to his mother's grave, then to the newer one 10 yards away. Mark Ellison, gone less than a week if you counted by the calendar, gone a lifetime if you counted by absence. Daniel stood there with his hands in his coat pockets and no rehearsed speech at all. "You should have told me," he said finally, looking at the stone. "Or maybe you tried, and I wasn't listening the right way." The dark pressed close around the cemetery. The town lights below, blurred by low clouds. "I got him," he said, after a while. "Not in time for you, but I got him." That felt inadequate the second he said it. Justice was thin company compared to the texture of a real man's laugh. His terrible taste in radio stations, the way he used to lean back in briefing chairs like rules were only suggestions. Daniel rubbed a gloved thumb along the edge of the marker, then stepped to his mother's grave and stood there too. He came back, he told her, and was startled by how much harder that sentence was to say here than it had been anywhere else. And it turns out he didn't do the worst thing they said. Just enough other things. He almost smiled then, painfully, because that also sounded like the family line. Not monsters, just people who found new ways to damage each other while trying to survive old damage. On the drive home, he passed Claire's street and saw her kitchen light on. For a second, he considered stopping, then kept going. Not because he didn't need her, because he knew she was likely sitting at the table with Ava, helping with spelling words or packing tomorrow's lunch, doing the small, ordinary tasks that keep grief from swallowing a house whole, and there was a kind of respect in leaving that untouched. He arrived at his own place, a narrow house on Cedar Lane he had bought after their mother died, and let himself into the stale quiet that only single people's homes seem able to hold. Coat on the chair, badge on the counter, half-read mail, a framed photo of him, Claire, and Mark after a county softball game 3 summers earlier. He picked it up and stared at it for a long time. Mark had one arm slung over Daniel's shoulder and the look of a man mid-joke. Claire stood on the other side, smiling in spite of herself. Daniel remembered that night suddenly. Remembered Luke's name coming up because some drunk in the stands had recognized the Mercer surname and made a comment loud enough to carry. Mark had shut him down so fast nobody else had time to join in. At the time, it had felt like simple loyalty. Now Daniel wondered whether Mark had already begun doubting the old case even then. Near midnight, Carla called. "Transport team leaves at 6, she said without preamble. "State wants Luke moved before daybreak." Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, phone to his ear, eyes on the dark window over the sink. "He know?" "Not yet. I'll tell him." Carla hesitated. "Danny, one more thing. Greeley's talking." Daniel straightened slightly. "How much?" "Enough. He's trying to bargain. Says Roy kept copies of everything, and Pike used the flood contracts to launder money into land acquisitions all over the county. Says Mark confronted him at the diner parking lot after following him there. Daniel's free hand tightened. "And the shot?" "Pike fired it. Greeley says he froze." Daniel closed his eyes. It was ugly confirmation, but confirmation all the same. Anything about Luke beyond the old case? Only that Pike wanted him dead the minute he learned he was back. "Daniel, let that settle." "Thanks. Get some sleep if you can," Carla said. He almost told her that sleep had become a rumor, not a plan, but instead he said, "See you at 5:30. After the call, he sat in the dark a long time, the house around him quiet except for the refrigerator cycling on and off. The story had moved closer to its end now. He knew that. Not finished, not emotionally, but structurally. The way storms weaken after the hardest winds yet leave all the damage visible in the daylight. They were approaching the final arc. Pike dead, Greeley talking. Luke cleared of the worst accusation. Mark avenged as much as dead men can be. What remained was narrower and harder, the human cost after the machinery stopped grinding. Before dawn, Daniel returned to the office, carrying 2 coffees again out of instinct more than thought, and went downstairs with one of them in hand. Luke was awake, sitting on the bench as though he had not slept at all. He looked up when Daniel entered and glanced at the cup. "That for me?" Daniel handed it over. "Don't make it sentimental." Luke took a sip and winced. Still, terrible coffee. For a second, the line almost sounded like the brothers they might have been in another life, and that hurt enough that Daniel shut it down immediately. "State moves you in an hour," he said. Luke nodded, absorbing the news without surprise. "Protective custody? For now." Luke rolled the warm cup between his hands. "And after?" Daniel leaned against the wall. "After depends on formal charges, testimony, old warrants, accessory exposure, probably a dozen things lawyers will fight over." Luke gave a small shrug. "I deserve some of that." "Yeah," Daniel said. "You do." They sat in silence for a while, the sort that was no longer empty, but not yet comfortable either. Finally, Luke said, "Claire told me about Ava's drawings, that she colors everything too dark because she likes storms." Daniel blinked, thrown by the specificity. "She showed you?" "No. She described one." Luke stared into the coffee. "She said Ava gets that from me." Daniel almost laughed at the absurdity and sadness of inheritance passing through stories instead of presents. "Maybe," he said. Luke set the cup down beside him. "Danny, when this is over, If there is any version of later where I get to stand in front of her, I'm not going to ask to be family first. I know better than that. I'd settle for honest stranger. Daniel looked at him, hearing in that sentence not self-pity but a rough, earned humility he had never expected from his brother. That might be all there is, he said. Luke nodded. Then that's what I'll take. The transport team arrived at 6 with quiet professionalism, 2 state officers in plain coats and 1 federal marshal, because the overlapping charges had already begun to multiply across jurisdictions. Papers were signed, cuffs checked. Daniel walked Luke to the rear exit to avoid the press now camped at the front. Snow had stopped overnight, leaving the lot washed in blue, pre-dawn stillness. As they reached the van, Luke paused and turned back. One officer gave him a second. I don't expect you to forgive me, Luke said. Daniel stood with his hands deep in his coat pockets, the cold air cutting between them. Good, he answered. Luke took that in, then said, but I am sorry. Not just because the town lied, because I did. Daniel felt the words hit some part of him that was still locked too tight to respond cleanly. He thought of the hospital parking lot confession, of their mother's porch light, of Claire coming out of the cell with her face changed, of Mark's last word. Luke, not as accusation after all, but as direction, as unfinished instruction. I know, Daniel said at last. It was the most he had. The officers guided Luke into the van. The door shut. The engine started. Daniel stood in the cold until the taillights disappeared down the alley, and when they were gone he felt no triumph, no cleansing release, only the strange, sober lightness of a man who has set down one burden and realized another. Older one still remains in his hands. He went back inside through the rear hall where the boiler pipes knocked softly in the walls, and the smell of old coffee and copier toner made the building feel suddenly exhausted, as if the sheriff's office itself had aged 10 years and 3 days. And when he stepped into the bullpen, Carla was standing at Mark's desk with a cardboard archive box in her arms, sorting the dead man's things with the brisk care people use when they know they are handling objects that can undo them if they pause too long. She looked up and read the answer in Daniel's face before asking, "He's gone?" Daniel nodded. Carla set the box down slowly. "How'd it go?" He glanced through the windows at the pale morning light spreading over the courthouse lawn, at the huddle of reporters in heavy coats, shifting around their camera tripods, at the townspeople driving past more slowly than usual, pretending not to stare. About as well as 2 brothers with 15 years of damage behind them can manage in 3 minutes by a transport van, he said. Carla accepted that with the small movement of her mouth that passed for sympathy when she was too tired for performance. State wants you in the briefing room in 20, she said. Greeley signed a full preliminary statement overnight. Daniel rubbed a hand across his jaw. Anything new? 2 names. A few county procurement people. 1 banker in Cody. He's trying to save his own skin, so half of it will need corroboration, but enough is real that it's widening fast. Daniel nodded, though the widening of the case now felt oddly remote to him, important, but no longer central, because the criminal architecture had already been exposed, and the remaining work belonged to teams, procedures, indictments, and time. Those things mattered. They simply no longer lived at the emotional center of the story. Mark did, Claire did, Luke did, in a painful and limited way. The town's false memory did. He crossed the room and stopped at Mark's desk, where an old county fair ticket stub sat under a paperweight beside a mug that read, "World's Okayest Deputy." Daniel picked it up, turned it once in his fingers, and set it back down with more care than he had intended. "I want to go to his house before the day gets away from me," he said. Carla's expression softened slightly. "His sister's there. She's waiting to talk to you." "I know." He had known since the night Mark died, but knowing and going were different things. Duty had given him excuses for delay. Resolution had removed them. Carla closed the archive box and slid it aside. "Then go before the briefing. Beth can wait 10 minutes. Daniel looked at her. "You sure?" "Daniel," she said, not unkindly. "You brought down a county fraud ring, lost a deputy, found your brother alive, and got half the state crawling through our files. If I can't buy you 10 minutes to do the one human thing on your list, I should quit." He almost smiled. "Don't quit." "Wasn't planning to." Mark's house sat on the west edge of town in a row of modest ranch homes built in the late 70s, the kind with chain-link fences, snow-heavy junipers, and practical porches that held work boots and a spare shovel rather than decoration. Daniel parked at the curb and sat for a moment with the engine off, watching smoke feather out of the chimney while morning sunlight struck the frost on the windows and made everything look briefly cleaner than it was. He could hear a dog barking 2 houses down and a distant school bus grinding its gears on the hill, ordinary sounds that felt almost offensive in their normalcy. But maybe that was grief too. the sense that the world should visibly stagger when one good man is removed from it. He walked up the shoveled path and knocked. Mark's older sister, Janine Ellison, opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been standing in the hallway waiting. She was 43, practical, broad-shouldered, with the same eyes Mark had and none of his ease. And Daniel had always liked her because she never treated law enforcement as anything glamorous, just the family trade that had already buried one man too early and now threatened to bury another. She looked at him for 2 long seconds, then stepped aside. "Come in," she said. The house was warm and smelled faintly of laundry soap and cinnamon toast. A casserole dish sat untouched on the counter, one of many no doubt delivered by neighbors trying to offer grief in edible form. Mark's coat was still hanging on the back of a kitchen chair. That sight nearly stopped Daniel cold, because clothes abandoned in ordinary positions always carried a special cruelty after death. The shape of a person still implied by fabric when the body itself was gone. Janine noticed his gaze and said quietly, "I haven't moved much." Daniel nodded. "You don't have to." She crossed her arms and leaned against the counter. "I know why you're here," she said. "And I know why you waited." He met her eyes. "I should have come sooner." Janine considered that, then shook her head once. "No, you should have caught the people who killed him, which you did. The rest is manners." That was almost exactly something Mark might have said, and it took effort not to let that thought show on his face. Janine poured coffee into 2 mugs without asking, and slid one across the table to him. He sat because standing suddenly felt too formal, too official for the room. For a while, neither of them spoke. A heater clicked on somewhere in the back of the house. The refrigerator hummed. Then Janine sat across from him and said, "Did he know?" Daniel understood at once. That it was dangerous? She nodded. "Yes," Daniel said. "I think he knew enough to hide evidence and enough to keep parts of it from me until he was sure." Janine stared into her coffee. "He always did that, even as a kid. Get halfway through climbing something stupid before telling anybody how high it really was." Daniel let out a breath that was close to a laugh, and nowhere near one. "Sounds right." Janine looked up again. "Were you angry at him for that?" The honesty of the question left no room for ceremony. "Yes," Daniel said. "And proud of him. And I wish he'd trusted me sooner. And I wish I'd seen it myself without him having to carry it alone. All of that at once." Janine's eyes shone but stayed steady. "Good," she said. "Because I don't need you to sanctify him for me. He was brave. He was also stubborn and annoying and absolutely capable of getting himself killed, proving a point." She paused, then added, "I just needed to hear he didn't die by accident. That there was a reason larger than bad luck," Daniel said. "There was." Janine nodded, as if placing a weight down. Then she reached under the table and brought out a sealed envelope with Daniel's name on it in Mark's handwriting. Daniel stared at it. "What is this?" "He dropped it off 2 weeks ago," Janine said. "Told me if anything happened, and I started hearing too many uniforms at my door, I should wait until after the funeral, and then hand it to you myself. I decided the funeral can be today, tomorrow, whenever I can stand to call the pastor, but this part didn't need to wait." Daniel took the envelope carefully. It felt too light for the force it carried. Janine stood. "Read it somewhere else," she said. "Not in my kitchen. I've already got enough ghosts in here." He understood. At the door, she stopped him with a hand on his sleeve. "Daniel, listen to me." He turned. "You don't get to turn this into one more bad-shaped wound and pretend that counts as honoring him. He was your friend. Be that before you be sheriff." The sentence landed hard, because it was true in exactly the way Claire's had been true. Be that before you be sheriff. Different people. Same knife. "I'll try," he said. Janine squeezed his sleeve once and let go. He did not open the envelope until he was parked on the north hill overlooking town, where the cemetery road curved above Silver Ridge and the whole place spread below in winter light. Courthouse, dome, church steeples, water tower, school, diner, river. The kind of view that made towns look simpler than the lives inside them. He sat with the envelope in his lap for a minute, then tore it open. Inside was one sheet of lined paper folded twice. "Danny, if Janine is handing you this, then either I was more right than I wanted to be, or a piano fell on me. And in that case, please make the report funny. I'm writing this because if things go bad, I don't want the last useful thing I ever tell you to be buried in evidence. First, if I'm dead, none of this is on you. I know you'll try to carry it that way. Don't. Second, if Luke Mercer is alive, hear him out before you let history do your thinking. I don't know if he deserves much, but I know he deserved better than the version of the story we were given. Third, this town is going to want a clean villain and a clean hero. Don't let them do that either. It'll make them feel better, and it'll teach them nothing. Last thing. Your problem has never been loyalty. It's that you think keeping everyone afloat is the same as telling the truth. Sometimes it isn't. Love you, brother. Sorry about the handwriting, Mark. Daniel read it twice, then a third time, eyes catching on different lines each time as though the letter were rearranging the furniture of his mind while he sat there. Love you, brother. Mark said it easily in life, often wrapped in mockery, or after some stupid softball game, or while handing Daniel bad coffee. But on the page, it cut through every last protective layer he had left. He folded the letter back with hands that were not entirely steady, and sat staring at the town below until the windshield fogged at the edges. He did not cry at first. He only breathed with difficulty, the kind that begins as restraint and gradually reveals itself as grief. When the tears finally came, they did not feel dramatic. They felt overdue. He let them happen because there was nobody there to perform for, and because Janine and Claire were both right, in their different ways, that there had to be some version of him left in this story who was more than the office stitched onto his jacket. The briefing room at noon was crowded with state agents, county attorneys, a forensic accountant on speakerphone, and Carla at the far end of the table, with 2 legal pads full of notes written in the severe block print that somehow matched her personality exactly. Daniel arrived late, and nobody said anything because his face probably told enough. Beth Harmon ran through the sequence of upcoming actions, sealed indictments, witness protection arrangements for lower-level cooperators, probable press leaks, the timeline for public release of the corrected Mercer robbery file. Daniel listened, contributed where needed, approved the immediate release of the suppressed witness statement and the formal posthumous commendation packet for Mark, but much of it passed through him now with a new distance. Not indifference, the opposite. He could finally see the case as part of a larger civic repair, rather than as a personal test he alone had to survive. When the meeting adjourned, Beth lingered. Sheriff Mercer. Daniel turned. Your brother's attorney requested a mediated family visitation down the line, once he's processed through state custody. Daniel nodded once. That'll be Claire's decision for her household. Beth studied him briefly. For what it's worth, your office cooperated faster than most. That matters. He appreciated the attempt, but praise felt unusable. Tell that to Ellison, he said. Beth did not flinch. I would, if I could. The rest of the afternoon moved in fragments. Signed forms. One call to the governor's regional liaison. A closed-door meeting with the county commissioner, who looked sick and angry in equal measure, though Daniel could not tell whether the anger was moral or merely political. Through it all, rumors thickened, and then began to settle into facts as the first official statements hit local radio and state websites. By 3 o'clock, the correction to the old bank case was public. Owen Pike named. Roy Bannon implicated posthumously. Luke Mercer formally excluded as the identified armed gunman. Daniel knew what that would mean for the town before he stepped outside and saw it on people's faces. Shock, yes, but also embarrassment. The awkward self-recognition of a community confronting how easily it had accepted the story that best fit its existing suspicions. People waved him down on the sidewalk to say some version of, "We never knew," and Daniel found that phrase increasingly intolerable, not because it was fully false, but because it disguised passivity as innocence. Plenty of people had not known. Plenty had also not wanted to ask. By early evening, he drove to Claire's house unannounced, carrying groceries he did not remember deciding to buy. Sandwich bread, apples, milk, cereal, the sort of staples people always need after a disaster, because the body still insists on breakfast even when the heart is less cooperative. Claire let him in with a tired glance at the bags. You look terrible, she said. That's not a thank you. It's my thank you voice. Ava was on the living room rug, drawing with markers, her braid coming loose, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. She looked up and smiled. Hi, Uncle Danny. The sound of it went through him with a strange tenderness after the last several days of death and accusation. Hey, Bug. He set the bags on the counter and knelt beside her drawing. A house under dark clouds, a road, a blue pickup, 3 figures standing in front of a mailbox. Who's this? He asked. Ava pointed. That's Mom. That's me. That's you. Daniel looked at the third figure. I look short. It's perspective, Ava said seriously, and Claire laughed from the kitchen for the first time in days. A brief, real laugh that changed the entire room. It made him realize how long the house had been holding its breath. Later, after Ava went upstairs to shower, Daniel and Claire stood at the sink putting groceries away. The corrected file went public, he said. Claire kept stacking cans. I know, Mrs. Hargrove from church texted me that she always suspected something didn't add up. Daniel snorted softly. Of course she did. Claire shut the pantry door and leaned back against the counter. That's how people survive shame. Retroactive intuition. He looked at her. You okay? She considered it. No. Better than yesterday. Worse than next month. Maybe. Then after a moment. You? He thought of Mark's letter in his coat pocket. About the same. Claire nodded, understanding without explanation. Did he say anything when they moved him? Daniel knew she meant Luke. He apologized. She gave a tired half-smile. That man has been arriving late his whole life. The line was so sharp and sad that he wished for a second Mark had been there to appreciate it. Claire, he said, and paused because the question felt larger than he wanted to make it. If he gets through the legal side of this and there's some version of later, do you think there's room? Claire looked up the stairs toward Ava's room, then out the kitchen window where dusk was falling over Birch Avenue. For what? A reunion montage? She said. No. There's no room for that. Daniel waited. Claire folded a dish towel carefully, buying herself time. But maybe there's room for witness, she said at last. Maybe, years from now, there's room for Ava to know him as the man he is, not the ghost he became. Maybe there's room for a holiday card, a supervised coffee, something honest and limited. People always think forgiveness means restoration. Sometimes it just means you stop making your whole identity around the wound. Daniel took that in. It sounded like Claire because it was unsentimental and still somehow more generous than he felt capable of being. Do you want that? He asked. She looked at him directly. I want not to hand this down untouched. Upstairs. Water started running through the pipes. Ava singing something half made up behind the bathroom door. The house alive in small domestic sounds. Daniel realized then that Claire had already moved farther toward the future than he had, not because she hurt less, but because motherhood gave her no choice except to think in inheritance. 3 days later, Mark's funeral was held at the Methodist Church on the Hill, the same one where the county held its pancake breakfasts and scholarship auctions, the same one where Daniel had once watched Mark bluff his way through a duet he absolutely could not sing. Snow was melting in dirty ridges along the curb by then, the first hint of thaw streaking the gutters, and the church parking lot overflowed with patrol units, county trucks, sedans, pickups, and people on foot. The sanctuary filled early, deputies in dress uniforms, state agents in dark suits, townspeople in black coats, carrying all the awkwardness of communal grief. Janine in the front pew, spine straight as steel. Claire beside Daniel, one gloved hand resting on Ava's knee. Daniel had not expected Ava to be there, but Claire had decided, and he understood why the moment he saw the girl's solemn face. Some losses needed to be named in rooms where children could witness adults honoring what mattered. The pastor spoke simply. Beth Harmon spoke briefly. Carla spoke with more feeling than Daniel had ever heard from her, which made it hit harder. Then Daniel stood for the eulogy, because there had never really been another possible choice. He looked out at the crowded sanctuary and saw not an audience but a town being asked, one last time, to resist simplification. Mark Ellison, he said, was not a saint. He would be furious if I stood up here and pretended otherwise. He left wet towels on bathroom floors, cheated at cards with the subtlety of a marching band, and thought every problem could be improved by terrible gas station coffee. There was a small, surprised ripple of laughter. Good. Mark would have wanted the room to breathe. Daniel continued. He was also brave in the least theatrical way I know. He paid attention. He noticed what didn't fit. He kept asking when it would have been easier to stop. And when he understood that the truth might cost him something, he kept going anyway. He paused, feeling the entire church listening from a place deeper than politeness now. A lot of people are going to spend the next few months talking about corruption, about evidence, about cases reopened and records corrected. They should. But I need to say this plainly. Mark did not die serving an abstraction. He died trying to keep his town from living inside a lie. There's a difference. And if we honor him, it can't just be with flags and processions. It has to be by refusing the kind of comfort that lets us choose easy stories over difficult truths. He did not look at any one person after that, because the sentence belonged to all of them. When he finished, the silence in the church felt full rather than empty. Outside at the graveside, wind moved across the cemetery carrying the damp smell of thawing earth beneath the cold. The honor guard fired. The folded flag was handed to Janine. Ava slipped her small hand into Claire's, and Daniel saw Claire blink hard but stay upright. Afterward, as people began drifting away in clusters, Janine stopped Daniel beside the line of parked cruisers. He'd have liked that, she said. Daniel did not pretend not to know what she meant. I had help. Janine touched the breast pocket of his coat, where the letter still rested. I know. By the following week, the immediate storm had settled into aftermath. Arrests continued. County offices conducted audits. People who had once spoken with certainty now spoke more cautiously. The diner repaired the parking lot light and quietly installed a small plaque near the entrance for Mark. Daniel returned to work not because everything was restored, but because work in a town like Silver Ridge had to continue through fracture if the place was going to remain livable. Yet he did not return as the same man. Carla noticed first, naturally, because she noticed everything. One evening, as they locked up after a 16-hour day, she said, "You're delegating more." Daniel glanced at her over the roof of his truck. "Is that a complaint?" "No. It's eerie, but not a complaint." He smiled faintly. "Mark left me a letter." Carla nodded once, as though that explained the entire shift, and in some ways it did. Weeks later, when the first formal court filings made Luke's limited role in the original robbery and his subsequent obstruction plain, Daniel read them in his office with the blinds half open and felt no simple emotion. Relief sat beside anger, vindication beside sorrow, accountability beside brotherhood. It was human and untidy, and therefore probably true. He wrote Luke exactly one letter in response to the request forwarded through state counsel. It was short. "Claire and Ava are well. The town knows the truth now. Or enough of it. I got Mark's commendation through. I am not ready for more than this." He mailed it before he could overthink the wording. Sometimes clarity required less language, not more. Spring came slowly to Silver Ridge. Snow retreated from the north slopes. Mud took over the alleys. The river ran louder. One Saturday in late April, Daniel helped Claire fix a sagging fence in her backyard, while Ava chalked blue storms onto the patio. Halfway through tightening a hinge, Ava looked up and asked, "Mom says families can be complicated. Is that because of the uncle I haven't met?" Claire and Daniel both froze for a fraction of a second. Then Claire set down the drill and crouched beside her daughter. "Yes," she said. "That's part of it." Ava considered this. Is he bad? Children were often cruel only by being efficient. Claire looked at Daniel once, then back at Ava. "He did bad things," she said carefully, "and some bad things were said about him that weren't true. Sometimes both happen at once." Ava accepted that with surprising ease, as children sometimes do when adults stop lying in the name of simplicity. "Will I meet him?" Claire brushed a strand of hair from Ava's face. "Maybe someday. Not soon." Ava nodded and returned to her chalk. Daniel watched them and felt something inside him loosen, a knot not gone but no longer pulling every movement crooked. Later, when Claire handed him a glass of iced tea on the back steps, she said, "See? Witness." He leaned back against the rail. "You were right." She smiled a little. "I usually am by the time you're willing to admit it." He accepted that too. Months after the shooting, after the first plea agreements, and the first ugly public hearings, and the first careful steps toward institutional cleanup, Daniel drove out alone one evening to the old Mercer farmhouse. State evidence teams had cleared it long before. The porch still sagged. The fields had gone wild in patches, but summer light lay soft across the fence posts, and for the first time in years the place did not feel haunted so much as unfinished. He stood in the yard where he and Luke had once thrown baseballs until dark, and listened to insects in the grass and distant traffic from the county road. He thought about his mother's porch light, about his father's silence, about Mark's letter, Claire's terms, Ava's question, Luke's apology, Pike's contempt, the town's hunger for neatness. He thought about how little of life could be repaired by revelation alone, and yet how impossible repair remained without it. After a while, he took a screwdriver from the truck and went up onto the porch. The old light fixture by the door hung crooked, dead bulb clouded by dust and years. He changed it, wired it back, flipped the switch inside the hall. Warm light spilled out across the porch boards and into the evening, modest and steady. Not a promise, not a vigil, just light. Daniel stood there watching it for a minute, then went back down the steps and looked once more at the house, at the fields beyond it, at the road leading away toward town. The hurt was still there. So was the anger. So was the absence of Mark, permanent and unfixable. None of that had been solved. But the lie was gone. The dead were named honestly, and the living had at least stopped pretending that silence was the same thing as peace. He got back in the truck as dusk settled over Silver Ridge and drove home through the long western light, the kind that makes even damaged places look briefly transparent, as if for a few minutes at the end of day you can see them exactly as they are and still choose to stay.